God of War 2018 is my second favourite game of all time, coming in close behind The Witcher 3. I was immediately enthralled by its combat, world and level design, but above all, its character, and one character above all else, Kratos. I had seen, and for a long time believed, the general consensus games media had given this revision of Kratos. That belief was that the previous God of War games paled in comparison to 2018's soft reboot, and along with it, Kratos as a character. Having never owned a PS3, and being probably too young for the original God of War games when they released, I was a virgin to this franchise pre the 2018 relaunch. And honestly, as someone who finds Norse mythology significantly more interesting than Greek, I mostly ignored these older games for a long time. But something had always been itching for me to fully experience this franchise had to offer. So with that, I bought a PS3, and all the God of War games I needed, and started with this, the introduction of this franchise, and Kratos in the first God of War.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
The game is immediately very different from 2018's. The first notable change in the opening was Kratos talking directly to the camera and the woman voiceover of Kratos jumping off the cliff attempting suicide. From the start, simply to emphasize Kratos' mindset and his tragedy as a character. It's also immediately recognisable as a PS2 game, but a very beautiful one, even with modern sensibilities. I believe this game still looks, and for the most part, plays great. And I think the thing that definitely holds up the most is clearly the combat. The combat is easily the most obvious standout feature of this game, and it's also the thing you do the most. The combat is fast, fluid, and fun, with a strangely addicting quality, taking the traditional hack and slash motion, with a light attack, heavy attack, dodge roll, block, and grab filling out the basic mechanics. The combat system works so well because of the endless amounts of variation just the basic set of moves Kratos can use against enemies. But on top of that, there are all sets of combinations that continually unlock for Kratos as the game continues and as you invest particularly in the blades, creating new ways to approach enemies even in the final sections of the game. Of course, this game made not just Kratos, but particularly his weapons, the Blades of Chaos, iconic. The two blades on the end of these change, with Kratos seemingly be able to manipulate them almost like magic, creates fantastic intrinsic motivation to enjoy this combat, as not only does it feel good and is fun to play, it looks fantastic as well. A combat system is nothing without the enemies to fight against. God of War largely relies on undead soldiers to be most of the fodder. That increase in difficulty, as throughout the game, they gain additional weapons, moves, and armor. Additionally, there are heavier enemies, minotaurs, medusas, and harpies, and all sorts of creatures pulled right out of Greek mythology. Each of these enemies also have their own movesets, and have different openings and attack patterns to them, meaning every time a new one shows up, you have to learn how to approach and defeat them, creating even more variety in the combat. God of War's combat is built on precision and timing, and has significantly more thought to it than I would say most hack and slash style games have. But of course, you can't talk about the combat without the quick time events. Quick-time events, as controversial as they are really a staple of this gameplay style and this era, using them to create not only flashy, brutal finishes in-game, but also finishing an enemy with an optional QTE gives Kratos a reward in the form of orbs, be it health, magic, or experience, perfectly merging the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to perform and use the QTE. Different enemies also use the QTE differently. Minotaurs are taking them out by button mashing, Medusas are from swirling the joystick in a certain direction, and plenty of other enemies is from pressing the buttons in an on-screen sequence. More to the combat though is the powers, one being the Rage of the Gods, a meter on the bottom of the screen that builds up and allows Kratos' basic attacks to be much more deadly for a limited time. The combat is also reliant on 2 meters at the top of the screen, the green one for health and the blue one for magic. Kratos throughout the game is gifted powers from the gods, Poseidon's Rage, Medusa's Head, Zeus's Lightning, and Hades' Minions. These are when the blue bar is charged up to create devastating attacks in different forms. Hades' Minions seek out the enemies, Poseidon's Rage creates an area of effect around Kratos, Medusa's Head turns enemies to stone, and Zeus's Lightning is a ranged attack. I was significantly surprised by the lack of bosses in the game, after being one of the few things I knew the franchise was famous for. In fact, there's really only 3. The Hydra in the opening mission, Hades' monster in Pandora's temple, and finally, Ares himself. Each of these have multiple phases that need the player to learn and adjust the moveset to deal with them, which is the best kind of bosses. The ones that simply have incredible amounts of health are just dull and require no thought through other than the process of repetition. I'm thrilled to see here that that wasn't the case. Like all good action-adventure games, puzzles are key to Kratos' journey throughout this game, and the first thing the puzzles allow for is the gameplay aspects to breathe and significantly helps the pacing. Puzzles are very similar to others of the era, clearly inspired from games such as Eco. Most of them involve moving an object or pulling a lever. The Temple of Pandora acts like one giant puzzle, and in this section particularly is almost like a Metroidvania, coming back to previous areas with new abilities and skills to overcome the challenge, such as being able to swim underwater. I initially felt like the game did a bad job of telling you which sections of the environment are interactable, and therefore how best to solve the puzzles and proceed. None of the puzzles are all that difficult and usually just involve working with the environment. I felt like even with the limited number of mechanics, this game did a great job at making things new. Such as, at first, moving objects was just to be able to move them so you'd be able to jump up to the next platform. But later in the game, you could move these objects onto pressure plates and even move a number of them to fit together like actual real-life puzzle pieces. I felt like these simple mechanics really shows the creativity the designers had for this game. Moving Kratos through this game is something. Kratos doesn't have any speed variation and can only default run or roll. This game has some rudimentary 3D platforming, which I personally struggled with a bit just simply due to the fixed camera perspective, which while I like throughout the rest of the game, became a little bit of an issue in these situations. Kratos can climb walls, which is absolutely my least favourite part of the game. It's slow and tedious, and enemies constantly spawn, slowing Kratos down even more to a crawl. And the variation in combat is gone in these sections. Other basic movement is rope swinging, which is really impressive for the time it's in, as well as balancing on beams, which is about as interesting as it sounds. The big thing for Kratos is when he gains Poseidon's trident, and is able to move underwater, controlling Kratos in a 3D space. It's never used for anything other than traversal, and is limited to just that. And just like games from this era, you have to find save points to be able to save your progress. Movement is probably the weakest element of this game. I would say none of it is really complicated or evolves throughout the experience. It's fine and it works, but it's the least impressive and engaging aspect of the game. The world design of God of War is absolutely one of my favourite things about it. I personally believe the art style still holds up today, and the way they portray the world of the gods is fascinating, utilising the names and relationships well known from mythology, and weaving them into this story and world. The game has lots of different environments, the oceans and ships, Athens, the temple which has desert cliffs, caves and the like, all of them more interesting than the last. Again, I like many, believed all the talk of this game being nothing more than a simple hack and slash with brutal and one-dimensional main character that uses Greek mythology as nothing more than set pieces. After playing this game, that analysis could not be more wrong, as this does so much to characterize Kratos, what he's endured and the world around him. First of all, this game is taking inspiration from many Greek writing is a tragedy, the tragedy of Kratos and what he goes through. We are first introduced to Kratos on the first sequence with the Hydra on the ship. We learn a few key things from this. First, he's nonchalant about the lives of the men dying trying to stop this beast. He's somewhat of an arsehole as he purposely pushes the captain into the belly of the Hydra for seemingly no good reason. But thirdly, he is devastated after finding the women and children have been slaughtered as his whole mission was to save them. This sequence shows us two sides to Kratos. He is an indeed brutal and hardened warrior, and in some cases vindictive. But he also cares deeply for the lives of the innocent and sees it as part of his purpose to help and protect them, obviously stemming from the failure to do so for his own family. From this first mission alone, we immediately see these two different sides to Kratos, completely dispelling this idea that he's a one-dimensional character. Once we reach Athens, and seeing Ares and the havoc he's tearing, we get a more in-depth look on Kratos and his history, as well as his disdain for the god. Kratos' backstory and much of the game is told to us through these beautiful, at least for a 2005 standard, cutscenes, with the narrator explaining the situations and emotions of Kratos throughout. The first thing we learn is that Kratos' history when he called out for Ares, becoming his servant while being bonded to the Blades of Chaos. This tells us more about Kratos' history as a Spartan warrior and leader. Conquest was Kratos' main drive, and his ruthlessness obviously stems from his time there. We also learn Kratos is ultimately seeking revenge against Ares, and this is the motivation of Kratos through the rest of the game. This takes us, the player, and Kratos on a journey guided by Athena, Ares' rival, to Pandora's temple, and ultimately to retrieve Pandora's box. Through Pandora's temple, Kratos is put to the test, having to show his resilience, strength, power, and determination to be the first mortal to ever reach the box. In terms of advancing a narrative for Kratos, there really isn't a whole lot here. What there is though is fantastic environmental storytelling and world building. Having Pandora's temple atop Kronos the Titan enslaved is not only beautiful imagery, but perfectly articulates the relationship between the Titans and the gods. In fact, Kratos is shocked to learn that a Titan still lives. The gods also, constantly through the story, choose to help Kratos, through Poseidon, Hades, and even Zeus. This turns out to be due to their disdain for Ares and his actions, and using Kratos for their plight against him. Throughout this experience, the player learns more of Kratos' backstory, how he served Ares faithfully and ruthlessly, conquering town after town, until one day, unbeknownst to Kratos, innocent victims of his own blade were his own wife and daughter. That Ares had set up the situation to make Kratos the ultimate warrior. This is where Kratos' vendetta against Ares stems from. After defeating all the trials, Kratos reaches Pandora's box, but as he does, Ares senses it and kills Kratos, sending him directly to the underworld. Kratos must climb his way through the underworld and back to the surface, but not before kicking down the captain of the ship another time. Kratos emerges from his own grave that an old man he'd previously interacted with had been digging for him, a beautiful setup earlier in the game. And Kratos then finds Pandora's box, uses it to give him the power to challenge Ares. The fight is threefold, and first has Kratos all powered up dispatch of Ares pretty easily, and then, in some genius blending of narrative and gameplay, Ares creates a vision of the night that Kratos killed his own family, and Kratos now has to protect them as versions of himself are attacking his family. And what makes this even more poignant is that the circle button, which routinely throughout the game has been used to finish enemies in brutal ways, is now being used to hug his family and sacrifice his own health to them. Saving them was all in vain, as it was just a vision, and Kratos returns to reality weaponless, and has to use the giant sword he walked across earlier. Changing the weapon in the final fight last minute, I found really irritating, as I had to get used to a whole new moveset, and felt I was consistently punished during this final phase of the game for simply experimenting with it. In the end, Kratos kills Ares, achieving his goal. Kratos then asks the gods for them to wipe his memories, as he feels he can never be free of seeing his family dead by his own hands. They refuse. Kratos, feeling hopeless and betrayed, attempts to kill himself by jumping off a cliff. Athena doesn't let that happen, and instead tells him he must now become the new god of war. A montage then plays of wars throughout our history, including very recent ones, claiming Kratos was behind all of it. I love it when the title of media is directly applicable to the ending such as this, although the final montage feels like a bit of a retcon, knowing elements from about later in the series. Kratos is a far more deep character than generally given credit for. Yes, he is brutal, cruel, and ruthless, but there's also true humanity behind him. He's significantly layered and has incredible troubled past that brings him to the point of choosing to end his own life after constantly being betrayed by the gods, after initially being nothing more than a servant of them. Kratos' plight is well understandable, and certainly is a character filled with many shades of grey, and not the murderous rampage I had heard so much about. I can't speak to later in the Greece games, and if they significantly reduce his characterization at all, but I certainly hope they don't. After knowing more about his journey through this game, it makes me appreciate his character in 2018 more, and vice versa, and I hope this situation sticks for the rest of the series. While the original God of War is certainly dated by today's standards, there is clearly still a magnificent game here. The spectacle of this game is crazy, and the core gameplay systems are all still intuitive and engaging. I feel the more simple art style adds to these aspects, but of course there's still an element of that old school difficulty. Generally, the game is more difficult than modern games, but nothing I couldn't eventually overcome. Under all that though, I think there's a story worth experiencing. If there's one takeaway I could give as someone who'd only played the 2018 iteration prior to this, it's that I feel both games add to each other. I believe 2018 is a better experience, knowing more deeply about Kratos' blight and backstory, and I feel the same about this game, knowing who Kratos eventually becomes. But seeing his origin adds to his journey and growth as a character. And while I certainly have a lot of other games right now to fill me on the story in between the two, If they're handled with the same care as this game, I'm sure the franchise will be nothing short of incredible. Thank you so much for watching this. I was really glad I got to experiencing this game and the start of this franchise. I'm planning on playing through the rest of the games in this franchise and making videos of them individually, so if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please subscribe, and if you like this video, leave me a like and let me know what you thought of God of War in the comments. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.